The opposite of fear is bravery. Nope. The opposite of fear is curiosity. Is the glass half empty? Is it half full? That misses the point. Elevating curiosity will help you see and understand what's in the glass. This is Applied Curiosity Lab Radio, the podcast of curiosity. In each episode, Becky Saltzman interviews unconventional thinkers and doers in her unconventional way to dissect and uncover what you can use to see things others miss, make better decisions, and apply your talents in new and profound ways. Elevate curiosity, escape the boundaries of ordinary.
Ultimately, it came down to if you want to have the best shot at saving your kid's life, you really need to step in and dedicate your life to this and spend a lot of time on it.
Hello, curiosity seekers and adventurous thinkers. Welcome to Applied Curiosity Lab Radio, episode 21. I am your host, Becky Saltzman. And today's episode, we are diving into cancer, specifically children's cancer and children's cancer research. Whether or not you've been touched by or exposed to children's cancer, if you're relentlessly curious like me, you're probably interested. Now, I am among the group of unfortunate parents who have received the call, the one that provides the test result for your child's biopsy, the one that explains the results in language that requires a bit of inquiry to ascertain exactly what that diagnosis means. Does that mean cancer? My family story ended well. Many of the stories of parents who receive this call do not. But there is really no template for the right thing to do. We all know that we need to be medical advocates for ourselves, for our friends, for our family. Does this extend to society? We talk about our need to be medical advocates, but what exactly does this mean? What exactly should you do? How do you ask and discover without alienating the experts? How do you filter the deluge of data, sometimes scary information that is easily found on the internet? How do you make sense of scholarly articles? How do you even access them? Should you meddle in the protocols suggested by the experts, or should you just let them do their job? Now, an orphan disease is a disease that has not been tackled by the pharmaceutical industry because it provides little financial incentive for the private sector to make and market new medications to treat or prevent it. An orphan disease may be a rare disease, according to the U.S. criteria, a disease that affects fewer than 200,000 people, or it may be a common disease that has been ignored because it's far more prevalent in developing countries than in the developed world. Examples of these are tuberculosis and cholera, typhoid, and malaria. And here's the deal. Patients with rare genetic disorders have actually fueled progress in the fields of human genetics and molecular therapeutics. These patients are often without options, and therefore they're enthusiastic to participate in research, often based on the remote promise of personal gain at a very real personal expense. Also, studying these orphan diseases clearly have an effect on our understanding of more common diseases. For example, research on Wilms tumor, which we're going to talk about today, which is a rare pediatric cancer, has been cited as a model for understanding the genetics, epigenetics, and molecular biology of pediatric cancers and cancers generally. If you value truly amazing stories filled with instructive takeaways, you'll want to stick around for this episode because today my guest is Andy Woods. Prior to 2011, Andy was a successful stonemason. He had no prior biology, biochemistry, or research background. He had no exposure to or experience with cancer. He wasn't even familiar with the term oncology. All of that changed with the diagnosis of his 4-year-old daughter, Stella, with a rare form of Wilms tumor called Anaplastic Wilms tumor. This is where Andy's life took a considerable turn. It is where his interest in cancer research began. As they progressed through Stellas treatments, it became apparent that her prognosis was poor, very poor, and her options were extremely limited. And thus, it became Andy's personal mission to attempt to provide more promising treatment options, not only for his daughter, but also for any child suffering with a rare cancer. Children with rare cancers often face a bleak prognosis with limited treatment options due to the fact that very little research has been done with their disease. Due to their small population numbers, there is very little investment in children with cancer, especially rare cancers. These cancers are often orphan diseases. Andy has dedicated his life to advocating for children with rare cancers and to finding ways to engage in further research for this population of cancer patients in the hopes of providing more effective and less toxic therapies. He joined the Children's Cancer Therapy Development Institute team in the summer of 2016, where he focuses on childhood kidney cancer research. We talk about how he became the most effective advocate for his daughter and for parents of children with cancer everywhere. We talk about how he learned to understand articles on Google Scholar and how he navigated academia, big pharma, and the associated roadblocks, politics, and economics. How do you do research? How can you find researchers working on relevant diseases and challenges? How do you convince big pharma to do a drug trial? We talk about exactly how he made his transition from stonemason to cancer researcher. He's so specific in his instructive story that I suspect that you'll come away with understanding exactly how you could make a dramatic career change, one that is very far from qualifying as a simple career pivot. This interview is probably less conversational than most because Andy is so riveting that I mostly let him tell me his story. And if you are confronted with a scary diagnosis, I hope you can let this episode be your guide. And now, without further ado, I bring you my episode with Andy Woods. Hi, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
Your story is fascinating, inspiring, daunting, but perhaps most importantly for listeners, it's instructive because it's a peek inside childhood cancer and cancer research and how to make what may seem like an impossible career change, especially when there appear to be no other options. Can you start by taking us back to Stella's stomachache in 2011?
Yeah, sure. So Stella Blue is my oldest daughter. And in 2011, when she was 4 years old or so, she started complaining about her crampies, she called them. And basically, as parents, we kind of went through the rigmarole of, what's going on with her? Maybe she's allergic to milk or something, or she appeared to be slightly anemic. And we just had no idea what was going on. And we tried a bunch of different things. But eventually, in September of 2011, we had brought her into the hospital because we couldn't figure out what was going on. And her blood counts were quite high. And you could also feel like a hardening mass on her belly. So unfortunately, come to find out, they eventually did an ultrasound and could see a very large tumor on her kidney. This all took place in Bozeman, Montana. And Montana is kind of a strange state. It's a big state, beautiful state, but only has a very small population of people. So they don't have any pediatric oncology programs in the state. So basically, once we found the mass in Bozeman, our pediatrician at the time, told us that we had about 24 hours. He said, you need to pack up everything and leave, get to a major childhood cancer treatment center. And the biggest ones near Bozeman were Salt Lake City, Denver, or Seattle. We didn't know anybody in Denver or Salt Lake, and we knew one person that I had gone to college with many, many years ago in Seattle. So that was pretty much how we decided.
Why did you only have 24 hours?
Well, at that point in time, it was an emergency situation. So the one interesting thing about Wilms tumor is that it actually starts in the developing fetus when the kidney is developing, and it just kind of slowly ticks along, and you have no indications, whatsoever that something's wrong, and it just kind of grows slowly, and then it grows exponentially at the end. So I can remember even as soon as like the week before we went into the doctor's, feeling her belly, trying to see if I could feel anything. And I really couldn't feel anything. It just felt normal. And then the day that we did bring her in, it was quite clear that there was a large mass there. I mean, you could feel it on the outside. So we realized that it was growing very quickly, and it was an emergency situation.
So you packed up your bags. What did that entail?
Well, it was pretty chaotic. I mean, as you and probably your listeners can imagine, you just never suspect that your kid's going to get diagnosed with cancer. And for us and our family, like, we knew absolutely nothing about cancer, much less childhood cancer. And we had been very fortunate, and cancer had not impacted either my wife or my family up until that point. So basically, knew absolutely nothing. We were sort of plunged into this world. At the time, I was a tile and stone contractor. So I had run a tile and stone installation business for 15 years or so in Bozeman. And so I had 3 employees and 4 jobs going all the time. We had just bought our first house, which was like a lovely little log cabin up in the woods, in the mountains outside of Bozeman. And we had also just given birth to our second child. So there we were, with Soren, who was the young one, at about 1 week old. And, life pretty much was chaotic as always. And then all of a sudden, we realized the Stellas situation was really dire. And we pretty much rushed home, tore the house apart, threw everything in a little car, and took off, and made phone calls on the way. So I called my friend in Seattle while we were on the way, and I hadn't spoken with her in like 15 years. But I still had her contact information, and I knew she was living out there. And so I called her on the way and said, "Hey, we haven't spoken a long time, but my oldest daughter just got diagnosed with cancer, and we're on our way to Seattle. And can we please, stay at your house while we kind of figure things out?" And she, of course, very nicely said yes. And that's what we used her place as a home base at first when we got out there.
Now, did you contact doctors along the way? Did you have a referral from your doctor at Bozeman? How did you navigate once you decided that you were going to make Seattle your destination?
Yeah, that was pretty much it. I can clearly remember like calling the hospital on the way. I often chuckle now because cancer and cancer terms, become really familiar. But I remember calling the hospital and trying to explain our situation. And I knew we needed a pediatric oncologist, but I didn't even know how to pronounce that word or what it meant. So it was a struggle at first. And I think, just being in the shock of the situation, the phone calls were pretty strange. It was me just calling the front desk of the hem-onc department saying, "Hey, my kid has cancer and we're on our way and we're going to need to be in surgery immediately." And them not really having any idea what was going on. But I do remember her saying, "Just keep coming. You're doing the right thing and we'll get this sorted out by the time you get here." And Seattle Children's is just an awesome hospital. So very much, as we arrived into Seattle at like 10:30 at night, they already had it lined up for us to come into the hospital the next day. And I think we were admitted the first day and just went through setting everything up and then spent the night in the hospital. And then immediately the next day we're in surgery.
What happened next?
We get out to Seattle, spent the night at our friend's house, and then went right to the hospital for the next day. We're basically told what was going on. She had a massive tumor that they could see via ultrasound and CT scan. And the plan was they were going to remove the tumor, remove the kidney, and anything else they ended up removing the adrenal gland as well, because the tumor was touching the adrenal gland. So that was a very intense surgery. The tumor at that time was, it was described to me as being the size of a cantaloupe, which you can imagine in a 4-year-old little girl is quite large. And so it was, I think it was like a 10 or 12-hour surgery. So it was terrifying to go through because we sat, in the we get into surgery first thing in the morning and it's pretty busy. There's maybe 20 people there all kind of waiting for their family or patients going through. And then throughout the day, as the surgeries wrapped up, they would all leave, and it ended up just us being there, and that was it. And there was just this waiting period of a long, long time where we just kind of waited. And finally, at 7:00 at night, the surgeon comes out looking very tired, but was able to give us the good news that they got the tumor out. So they removed the kidney, the adrenal gland, and the tumor, and it was a successful removal.
While you were waiting during that time, other than sitting with your newborn baby, what were you doing?
Pretty much just waiting. At that point, it's like I said, it's a terrifying scenario to be in, and especially that's right in the beginning when you just don't know anything about cancer, and so there's financial issues to worry about. There's I was concerned about my work, because I had employees that were depending on me. So I was spend a lot of time on the phone with them, trying to explain the situation that they would have to kind of finish up these jobs. And I knew very little about cancer at that time. And I can remember, telling them I'd be back in 2 or 3 weeks.
How did you choose 2 or 3 weeks?
Probably just randomly, just because I didn't know any better. So I thought, well, this will be a good long stay in the hospital, which to my mind at that time was 2 or 3 weeks. It ended up being almost 2 years of treatment that we were away from home. So it was quite different than what I was expecting. But again, that just kind of speaks to the naiveness, I guess, that I had and that probably most people have about childhood cancer.
So when you get the good news that they've removed the kidney and the adrenal gland, what were they telling you at that time were your next steps?
Well, at that time, we had to wait for pathology to come back for an official diagnosis, but they were pretty sure that it was Wilms tumor. Wilms is the most common childhood kidney cancer, so it's a pretty classic case of that. And so I would ask them about, Wilms and the prognosis and the treatments and stuff. And fortunately for most Wilms kids, it's almost 90% curable. Many kids respond well to traditional chemotherapy and radiation. Unfortunately for us, when the pathology report did come back, I don't know, a week later or so, she was diagnosed with stage 4, which is pretty advanced, and then also a subtype of Wilms tumor called Anaplastic Wilms tumor. And unfortunately, for the 8%, about 8% of Wilms tumors are anaplastic, and those kids do not respond well at all to therapies. And so the prognosis, for normal Wilms kid is about 90% successful, but when they have anaplasia, the odds just plummet, and we were looking at maybe a 30% chance of success. And then also we found out then that the cancer had metastasized, so it had already spread up to her lungs, which is, of course, portends a worse prognosis. So that was heartbreaking. Yeah.
What were some of the questions looking back now in that period of panic? What were some of the questions that you asked? How did you get up to speed so quickly?
Sure. Well, I'll first say it took a while to get up to speed. I mean, we were really plunged into the situation that absolutely nothing about. So it was very challenging to know what questions to ask. Basically, at that time, I was really focused on what are the treatment options? What are we going to do to cure my daughter? And I wanted it really spelled out as to what chemotherapies we were going to get, what radiation treatment we were going to get. That was pretty much it at that point in time. I will say, we were very focused on treatment, and we had very high hopes that that treatment would work. And so that's essentially what we did is we went through, I think it was about 7 to 8 months of treatment. They wanted to treat aggressively because they knew it was an aggressive disease. So we did 2 weeks of radiation treatment and then I think it was 35 rounds of chemotherapy.
35 rounds of chemotherapy?
Yep. It was which is a more intense protocol than most Wilms kids get. But again, it was because they knew it was the anaplastic subtype, so they wanted to treat as aggressively as possible.
Were there ever any times in talking with the doctor? I mean, you just got the doctor you got. Did you feel lucky to get the doctor you got? Did you keep this original doctor that you got? Did you challenge the doctor in any way that might have changed or influenced protocol? Or were you just kind of so shell-shocked that you just went along with whatever the doctor suggested for that particular kind of Wilms tumor?
Yeah, I'll say again, like at first we definitely were shell-shocked, and we're just going along with what the doctors were saying. I'll quickly point out that we landed in Seattle kind of randomly, but we couldn't be more happier with Seattle Children's Hospital. They really are just a top-notch organization, and we picked up on that right away. So we felt confident. We felt like we were in very good hands from the get-go. And still to this day, we feel that way. And so what we did was we went through that aggressive treatment. We were able to, successfully remove the tumor and then shrink any evidence of disease down to nothing that they could see on a CT scan. So they call that NED, or no evidence of disease. And so we achieved that after 7 months of therapy, and we were able to move back to Montana for a few months, which was really nice. That was another thing that was like the main goal, was to get through treatment and be able to move back home, because like I said, we had just bought our first house, and it was a very different lifestyle, in Seattle compared to Montana. So we all missed Montana terribly and kept our eye on that prize of going home. And when we did move home, we had high hopes that we had gotten it. We knew that our odds weren't good, but Stella was a special kid, and we had gone through aggressive treatments. And so at that point in time, I really just wanted to put it all behind me. And I can remember my mom saying, suggesting that, hey, there's these great, online support groups for Wilms tumor. And me just saying, look, I don't want anything to do with cancer ever again. We paid our dues, and I'm going to put it behind us and kind of hope for the best that she got it. Unfortunately, the way it worked for us was she relapsed almost right away. So we moved home, and we had our first set of scans 3 months later to look at it, and it was already growing back in the lungs. And that was even worse than the first round. We had some experience under our belt, but because we had just sort of put it away and didn't want to think about it anymore, and then all of a sudden there it was with a relapse right in our face. That for me was really difficult to face.
During that 7 months that you were in Seattle, were you running your business in Bozeman from Seattle? How were you, and how would someone pay their bills?
Sure, which is a good question. We were very fortunate to have like the support of the community around us and family. And so the community of Bozeman just rallied around us. I mean, I think everybody was in shock, to see, it's a small town. So we knew a lot of people in town, and a lot of people knew us and Stella. So when she was diagnosed, our friends and family and community members really rallied around that. And they had many fundraisers, and we would just get checks, which was something that is kind of a tough pill to swallow, or was for me at first. I've always been an independent person and never accepted charity in my life. I was always the one giving charity, not the one receiving it. And it was very hard to learn how to accept that. But the flip side was, like, Stella was potentially dying of cancer. So I knew that my time could potentially be limited with her. And so I didn't want to I wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. And then also having the newborn baby, I just didn't feel like it was an option to, say, move back home and work from home to pay the bills while my poor wife was stuck in Seattle with a cancer kid and a newborn baby.
Right.
So to me, it was never really an option to go down that road. So I just stayed in Seattle, went through treatment, and it was like, we'll just figure out a way to pay the bills one way or the other.
Then you move back to Bozeman, and 3 months is all you have before this devastating news of a relapse. What happened next?
So we enjoyed our 3 months. It was summertime in Montana. It was great to move back home. And then we had to drive out to Seattle to do our first set of scans, and they could see it relapsing in her lungs. And so that was just like the ultimate sucker punch, for me. But basically we said, well, let's go, do something fun. So we took a Make-A-Wish trip. And Stella wanted to go to Disney World. So off we went to Disney World for a couple of weeks while the doctors in Seattle kind of figured out a treatment plan. And so we took the Make-A-Wish. It was a great trip for the kids. It was not so great for the parents. Just you really, you understand why you're there on the Make-A-Wish trips. And so it's not the most pleasant, feeling as a parent.
Sure.
And then sort of knowing what's looming when you get done that trip and go back to Seattle. So, but that's what we did. And then we went back to Seattle, and the tumor board had met, and basically they sat us down and told us the treatment plan, which was, well, if we, the thought was, okay, we didn't get it the first time with fairly aggressive treatments, and now we're just going to give it the all out sort of last ditch effort and treat really aggressively. And so their proposal was a stem cell transplant, which just to spell out for people, like the stem cell transplant, the transplant is actually rather anticlimactic and not the most important thing. The important thing is the super high dose of chemotherapy that they give before the stem cell transplant. And so they just give this mega dose of chemotherapy, which they describe to you as they basically kill the patient and then rescue the patient back with harvested stem cells. And so it's so much treatment that the patient would essentially die without some sort of rescue. And then they rescue the patient with blood stem cells, essentially. Before the patient goes through treatment, they harvest blood stem cells from the patient, and they cryopreserve them, they freeze them. And then they give the patient a super high dose chemotherapy. And basically it's so intense that all your blood numbers just go down to zero, and your natural blood and bone marrow wouldn't be able to recover naturally. But then they infuse those stem cells that they had harvested earlier back in, and theoretically that forces the blood to wake up, I guess, and the numbers start coming up. So when they give that treatment and then the blood numbers crash and then they infuse the stem cells, there's this sort of really scary waiting period called engraftment, where you're waiting for the infused cells to engraft, and you're hoping and praying that the numbers will come up. And fortunately for us, Stella engrafted relatively quickly, so it took 6 or 7 days.
What's the average time of engraftment?
I'm not sure. I would venture to say anywhere from 10 days to maybe 10 to 20 days for a lot of patients. So she was on the quick side with 6 or 7 days.
What were you doing?
Just sitting in the hospital, at that point in time. It's like, it's a scary time because they don't get affected right away. So they basically go in and you go for your chemotherapy, and they just give this huge dose, and then you watch her or the patient just sort of slowly slip into this almost coma, and it takes a few days for all the drugs to sort of really kick in, and so you're just waiting and watching, essentially. And then after that few days, when she's good and out, then they transfuse the stem cells back in, and that's not a miracle cure by any means. That's just to save her life at the end. And then the effects of the chemo really come on, and it's really horrific. I tell people the nitty-gritty was that she basically for 30 days, she was in that hospital, and she had a fever of 104 plus, and it never broke for that 30 days. She like all her skin got brown and fell off. She had mucositis, her face blew up like the size of a softball, and she had mucositis from her stomach all the way down to the other end. And then just constant diarrhea and nausea. And it was just absolutely horrible. All you do is sit in the hospital and just monitor. And she's hooked up to like 4 poles, and there's just constantly doctors and nurses coming all the time. And I can't even tell you like how many different medications she was on. Lots of painkillers so that she sleeps most of the time. And I'll never forget the transplant doctor, coming in and saying like, look, it's going to be hard and it's going to be a miserable experience. And the more she sleeps, the better. So anytime there's any, indication of pain, give more pain drugs and just try to have her sleep through it.
When did you go from, where oncology was kind of a foreign word, to delving into the research? When you were back at Bozeman before she relapsed, were you online, or did you just say, okay, this is over, I don't want to look into this, I don't want to get on the Googles, I don't want to even know about this? Or were you kind of one of those always looking into new things? What was that turning point for you?
It was right around transplant was the turning point. But to answer your question, like not so much before that. Like I said, I really wanted to put it behind me, and I really wasn't interested, in pursuing it any further. But for me, I'll tell you the exact turning point was before transplant, when we were talking with our doctors, and they were sort of proposing this treatment regime. And my question to them was, well, surely this will get it, we treated aggressively before and that didn't get it, but now we're like doubling the treatment and we're killing the patient and rescuing her back. And surely like her odds will improve now. And the answer was actually not, actually, because she's relapsed, her odds go down. And that's the reason that we're treating so aggressively. And so we were given, at that point, like 10% chance of survival, or maybe even less, because she had metastasis involvement, and that's where it had relapsed. It's just things were not looking good at all there. And so I kind of had to grapple for a little bit with, okay, you have this treatment protocol. It's really aggressive. But we almost know it's not going to work, like it only works in a small percentage of patients, if that. And that to me was like an aha moment and a really a huge turning point for me when I realized that was the case. And then I also realized that while I love my doctors and I love my team in Seattle, like they're very busy people. And if there's one person that can be like the strongest advocate, it was me, that ultimately it came down to like, if you want to have the best shot at saving your kid's life, you really need to step in and dedicate your life to this and spend a lot of time on it, because doctors are great, but they have 50 patients, that they have to split their time between. Whereas as a parent or a caregiver, you have one patient. So you can focus all your time on that patient. And so there was that kind of realization. And then also the kind of obvious realization of like, well, you're giving this treatment that you almost know is not going to work. And so what are the other options? And to me, that meant, okay, the old stuff doesn't work. I have to look for new and promising research that's coming out like today, and then try to push that into clinical settings. And the whole time I'm thinking that Stella's going to get through this treatment, but she's highly likely to just relapse right away. And there's nothing left, like we've already been through the treatment, this is it. This is all the standard treatment protocols. So if she were to relapse again, there would be no options for her on the table and we'd just be sent home to die. And to me, it was like I saw that was a moment that I could really try to make a difference. So that's kind of what I did. And I started that approach with thinking, okay, I have a year of experience of like clinical experience with cancer, but I really need to understand this disease in detail. I almost need to become an oncologist. but I don't have the time to go to school for 6 years. I need to figure this out right here, right now. And sort of when I made that realization, that's when I really got to work. And I just essentially tried to self-teach myself cancer and oncology. And I did that through Google. was a big part of it. And I'll also say that, like, up until this point in my life, I was practically computer illiterate. I had an email address and checked it once a month, and that was about it. So I just didn't have a need for computer work up until that point. But I realized that this was a great way to learn. I also found I was aware that there's a lot of stuff that's not all that accurate on Google. And so one of my first questions, like, how can I weed through what's good research and what's just, propaganda out there on the internet? And I was lucky to find Google Scholar fairly early on. And when I did find Google Scholar and sort of started pouring through that, I was like, hey, this is great. Google Scholar is essentially a Google search engine, but it's only for research and journal articles. So it's all journal articles published online. And I just thought that was wonderful. I didn't necessarily understand the journal articles at that time, but I could see that it was like peer-reviewed research, which I felt surely was much better than just reading on regular internet.
What did you do? You go online, you find Google Scholar, and I find that a lot of the stuff on Google Scholar are abstracts, and it's really difficult to get beyond the abstracts. I'm sure you had a strategy for that.
Yeah.
Number one. And number two, how did you go from understanding so little about the language? I mean, you didn't even use email, for God's sake, but how did you go from that to understanding these academic papers? Can you tell of the process that might be instructional for people listening to copy your method?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest thing is not to give up, and I mean, I think really, like, when I first had those, the first journal articles, I literally understood less than 1% of what was in those articles. It's really, if anybody's read an oncology paper, it really is like a foreign language, and I can remember just reading like paragraphs and just kind of laughing to myself because thinking, like, this isn't even English, like how can I possibly understand this? But having the motivation of your kid, potentially dying and at least putting into your mind, or the way I looked at it is like, this is my chance, to try to find something and try to make a difference, and quitting isn't an option. That was basically what it comes down to, is if you read through a whole article and you only understand once, then just go back, or you only understand 1%, then just go back and read the article again, and then you'll understand 2%, and then go back and read it again, and you'll understand 3%. And so you just keep doing it over and over again, and eventually you'll understand quite a bit more than that first time. And then in regards to access, you're right. A lot of the stuff on Google Scholar is abstract, and then the full article is not the average person has access to it. So my runarounds to that were several things. One, a lot of the articles are open access, so a lot of times you can get full access. Two, the abstracts, while they're brief and just a summary, they are also informative, and you can learn quite a bit just from the abstracts. And one thing I would do is, if I had an abstract that was the only access I could get to, and I was really interested in it, and I felt like this is worth exploring, then you just use some of the, terms in the abstract as search terms and search those on Google Scholar. And oftentimes a different article will pop up that you can get access to, that explains kind of the same ideas.
That's a great trick.
Yeah. So just relentless pursuit of that information will eventually get it to you. And then I was lucky. I'm not sure how many people are in this situation, but when I did get back to Bozeman, or I had friends in Bozeman, Montana State University is there. and it's a public institution, and they have access. They have institutional access, so they can access all journal articles. And lucky for both nights, it's open to the public, so anybody can go into the Montana State University library, and you get on their computers and you have access to any journal article you could possibly want.
At this point, you are getting more and more well-versed in not only cancer, but Wilms tumor specifically. And what happens? What do you do with this information? Your daughter goes through, she's coming out of the engraftment process. The doctors are still saying best case scenario is not the best case scenario. What did you do with this information? Were you bringing all this stuff to the doctor, bugging the doctor all the time? Were you trying to kind of understand it before bringing it to the doctor? How were you digesting and handling the information?
Yeah, so basically I recognized, right away that I was a novice in that world, and I had to learn it first. So I wasn't going to the doctor with every journal article I could find. I don't think they put up with that for very long. But I would just sort of, keep reading, keep teaching myself. And I'd use other resources too. I mean, Google Scholar is great, but we had both, the clinical experience of going through it every day. So I started really paying attention to what everybody was doing and what we were going through. There's also libraries at hospitals. So there's the hospital library I would go to. And then when I did find something interesting or something really curious, I would mention that to my doctors and try to have a discussion about it and see what I could pull out of that discussion.
Were you coming in contact with other parents in similarly desperate situations, or were you kind of alone in this misadventure?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say a little bit of both. I think my particular approach was maybe a little bit novel in that world, and that I was really trying to buckle down and say, I'm going to learn this disease and I'm going to try to make a difference, through research for my kid. I think that's a little bit of an extreme, but it was just sort of the path that I chose to go down. But then the flip side of it is you are, when you're in the hospital and going through treatment, you are also surrounded by other families and other patients. And that's certainly really valuable to talk about, because you go to the cafeteria together, you're living together in the hospital. So it's easy to have conversations with other parents and other people. It's easy and nice, because they're not doctors. And so they don't understand it at that level. But it's nice to be able to have that conversation with someone who's more down at your level and discuss things that way. So my whole game at that point was to learn cancer, and then I was going to look for what's the newest and greatest research that's coming out right now about Wilms tumor, and hope that would lead to something that was clinically applicable, some sort of research that we could push into the clinic and have it be an option for Stella if she were to relapse. And so there's several miracles in the story, and that is one of them. Was that on the very day of Stella's transplant, it was just crazy busy, and we were stuffed in this little tiny, it was like a broom closet of a room. So it was just this really tiny hospital room, and there's Stella sort of slipping down into this coma, and they've decided today's the day we're going to transplant the stem cells back in. And so when they do that transplant, like I said earlier, it's very anticlimactic. It's just a bag of blood hanging and goes in, but they're keeping a very close eye on Stella. And so there's constantly this in and out of nurses and doctors, and my wife's there. And then of course, Soren, the little one, picks that time to get really fussy. And so I kind of looked at the situation and I said, okay, everything's under control here. I'm going to go walk around the hospital with Soren and try to get her to sleep. I became famous at Seattle Children's as the Bozemanite, the guy in Carhartts with a big beard that walks miles, miles and miles around the hallways of the hospital with a little baby on my shoulder, because Soren was, Soren's an awesome kid, but she was a pretty fussy baby. And so the only thing that would calm her down was me walking. So I got very familiar with the hallways of Seattle children. So that's what I did that day. I said, everything looks good here. I'm going to go for a walk with Soren. We walked around. She kind of fell asleep on my shoulder, and it was right near the computer lab. So I said, okay, now's a good time. I'll sit down in front of the computer and open up Google Scholar, and I'll type in Wilms tumor. And one of the interesting things you can do on Google Scholar is search by date or time frame. So I would be searching, what came out, what was published about Wilms tumor today, or what was published, in the last week. And so I put that search in, and the first thing that pops up is this paper, which I'm not going to get the full title correct, but it's essentially was the isolation and characterization of the cancer stem cell for Wilms tumor provides promising therapeutic targets or something like that. And to me, I somewhat understood that title or the paper, but it sure looked exciting to me. And I just thought, aha, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for new research that's promising and something that's applicable to the clinic, this therapy. And so there it was. And it was this nice paper that a group in Israel had published where they had identified for the first time the cancer stem cell for Wilms tumor and also named a drug that targeted that stem cell. Essentially what the cancer stem cell theory is, it says, okay, these tumors are made up of a whole bunch of different cells, hundreds of different kinds of cells. And a lot of those cells are killed by traditional treatments, chemotherapy and radiation. But within those tumors, there's a really small population of cells called cancer stem cells. And these cells are both tiny in size and also really hard to treat. And so many chemotherapies do not affect these small cancer stem cells. And then these cancer stem cells retain stem-like properties, so they can be missed by treatment, and then they have the potential to grow full tumors. And so that aligned perfectly with our experience in the clinic, in that we had this big tumor, we had gone through treatment, we'd shrunk the treatment down to no evidence of disease. So everything you could see on a CT scan was clear, but then we relapsed right away. And so we had treated, but we had obviously missed like a couple of these cancer stem cells, and that's what regrew the tumor. And so to me, when I kind of figured out that theory and looked at it and how it aligned with what we had gone through, I thought, okay, there's the key. What we need to do is not only treat all these cells in the tumor, but also find a drug and add it to the treatment backbone that targets these cancer stem cells. And then we can put it to bed for rest, I guess, kill all the cells truly, and then we don't have to worry about relapse. So I was very excited about that paper. I will say I can remember just being in the shock of it all and going through that. I remember thinking, this is too good to be true. Like, here I am, like looking for this sort of needle in a haystack, and I think I found it. Like surely I'm nuts because I'm going through this very traumatic experience, and this has just got to be too good to be true. And so I questioned myself, and I said, is this really as promising as I think? And I better spend some time like really studying this paper so I know it really well. And so that's what I did. So I must have read that paper 100 times easily. And then I did things so I would read the paper. Once I felt like I had a good understanding of that, I looked at all the references in the paper. So there was maybe 100 references to write that paper, and I would look all the references up and read those papers. And then I also questioned myself and thought, well, is this really, as good as I think it is? And does something like this, come out every few months in the cancer world, or is this really sort of a groundbreaking study? And so what I did, again, on Google Scholar, you can search by date. And so I would just go back through the years. And what I attempted to do was look at all the research that's ever come out about Wilms tumor, which is, I was not able to look at all of it. It's just massive amounts of journal articles. But I was able to go back and just sort of review and look for, promising type articles. And then I would read those articles. And then I'd kind of ask myself, if this is as exciting as the Wilms tumor paper that I just found. Ultimately, the answer that I sort of came away with is this really is exciting. It seems like the next big thing, that could be for Wilms tumor. So at that point, kind of when I reached that decision, I decided, okay, here's this research, here's this drug that they name in the paper that, at least on their research in mice, was very, very successful. 100% tumor, it eradicated 100% of tumors in mice. And so I thought this is a very promising approach. And so the first thing I did was I reached out to the authors in Israel who had done the paper, and I wrote them this very long, probably 10-page email, sort of explaining who I was and the situation I was in.
Before you reached out to the Israeli researchers, that day that you found the article, did you print it out and race it to the doctor, or did you just keep it to yourself? What did you do between the time you saw it and the time you read it 100 times and sent that letter or that email to the Israeli researchers?
So I wanted to make sure that I understood the article very well before I went to my doctors with it. So I did read it a whole bunch of times. But when I did kind of decide, like, this really is promising, I not only reached out to the researchers, but I also went to my doctor with it and said, don't you think this seems really exciting to me? Do you think this could be a possible treatment for Stellas? And her answer to me, I'll never forget, was probably not. And I think you're a little bit, wasting your time doing this because you just don't have the time. I mean, like, this is the research paper and it's very nice preclinical data. But by the time this will get into, something available in the clinic, you're talking years and years and years. And quite frankly, you don't have that time. If she's going to relapse, it's going to be right away. So it's a little bit of a waste of your time to be going down this road. That was the doctor. And then my response was, kind of shock and also like, what other choice do I have? And I also saw it as a challenge. My response, like walking out of that meeting, was, you just watch me bring that thing into the clinic. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to try as hard as I can and try to do it as fast as I can, because I recognize that it is a race against time, but I don't see any other path forward, like this is it. So that's what I did.
It's an interesting thought that you were able to get a response back from this researcher. Can you give a little bit of insight into how did you write the letter, and what do you think is the reason that they responded back to you?
Sure. Well, I'll say you're right. Typically a 10-page, impassioned letter that spells out every little detail is more likely to not get a response, just especially with doctors and researchers. They're very busy people, and I don't know if they necessarily have the time or the emotion, investment to get through that and read it and respond. And I often think this gal that was the lead author that I reached out to, her name is Naomi, and she really filled me with a lot of hope by the fact that she did respond. I'm not quite sure, why she did, but I think just here's this guy, and he's, his daughter's potentially dying, and he seems like he's working hard to find, treatment options. And I think maybe that prompted the response. But I asked her really tough questions. I asked her, I explained the situation that we were in. I explained that I had found her paper and that I was really excited by it. And I asked her, what are the flaws in your paper? And I kind of was pretty hard about it. So I'm like, my kid could potentially really use this treatment. And so I want to know, should I be excited about this, or are there flaws in the study? And then I also asked her questions like, what would you do, if you had this research and you had a child with cancer and you wanted to get this drug, available for your child, like what would the steps be that you would take, to do it?
Brilliant.
Yeah. And she, very nicely responded and answered all my questions. And her suggestion, was, she said, well, if I was in that situation, I think maybe the first step would be to gather some support. So put together, patient community of Wilms tumor families and patients and get them on board, see if they're as excited about it as you are. And then go to the pharma company that makes this drug and ask them to do a trial for Wilms tumor patients. And I just thought, great, that's a clear path forward. Sounds like a good idea to me. And so I got to work on it that day. And that's where I moved from like research on the computer to also exploring social media on the computer, because I thought, okay, here's how am I going to meet these other Wilms tumor patients? I'd met other cancer families, but none with Wilms tumor. So it was like, how am I going to reach out? And a lot of it was through email, but a lot of it was on Facebook too, because I didn't understand Facebook at all at that time, but I did see that it was this giant sort of network tool and that you could connect with people all over the world. I thought, well, there's a good way to meet other people in similar situations.
What did you do on Facebook to reach out to other families with children with Wilms tumor? And how long between sending off the letter and receiving the letter back and starting to collect the names of these families? I mean, what are we looking at? Weeks, months?
Well, it was a matter of weeks. It was probably like a month of, doing research. And then I reached out to Naomi and the researchers, and she got back to me in maybe a week to 10 days with her response and suggestions. And because it was a clear path forward, I got to work that day, so that day I created a Facebook account. And there's also, not many people use it anymore, but there was the ACOR listserv, which is, I think it's a American Cancer Society organization, but it's basically a listserv for support groups for cancer. So that's what I reached out to people on at first. And I basically just wrote a letter that said, hey, my name's Andy Woods. I'm the parent of a Wilms tumor kiddo, and I found this great research that names a drug that seems to be more promising, and talked a little bit about the cancer stem cell theory. And I just put out there that, hey, my idea is to try to get some support together, gather together, and then go to the drug company and see if they will run a trial. Does anybody want to join me? And so that's essentially was the start of it. Just the series of meeting people through social media, getting connected on email with people. We put together a list of people, essentially a petition of sorts that said that we are the Wilms tumor patient community. We like the research behind this drug, and we think that the drug will be really effective against Wilms tumor. And will you please start a Wilms tumor trial?
So you just went onto the website of the pharmaceutical company. You found the division for this particular drug. You found an email after collecting a bunch of other parents who also had kids with Wilms tumor who were wanting to be or interested in being part of this cohort, and then just sent off the email to this person at the pharmaceutical company.
Yep, that was it. So the pharmaceutical companies are all publicly owned companies, so they have information on their websites, contact information. And I figured out, pharmaceutical companies are big and they're all working on different things, but I would look at the papers that have been put out on this drug, and I figured out who the authors on the paper were that worked at the drug company. And so there was maybe on some of the papers, there'd be 10 to 15 authors. But 3 of them were people that worked at the drug company. And so I figured out, who they were based off the company's website, and then got their email addresses, and then just, essentially sent them an email with a list that I gathered of people that were supportive of it, and asked them if they'd be willing to run a trial.
What happened?
It's not that cut and dry. They very nicely responded and said, "Hey, we're glad you're interested in our drug and supportive of what we're doing, but we're not interested in running a trial for Wilms kids." They were much nicer about it than that, but that was essentially the takeaway of the email. And I should state now that I consider myself very pro big pharma. I am not against big pharma by any means. I see them as a valuable ally in the fight against cancer. And while they have their challenges and can sometimes be very difficult to work with, my approach always has been be friendly, be nice, and attempt to work together, and just don't take no for an answer. And when they do tell you no, figure out good runarounds, that are not going to pit you against the drug company or the drug company against you, but are going to sort of set up situations where you can both work together. So that's always been my approach. And so when they told me, well, that's great, but for a variety of reasons, we can't do this, I just would say, well, okay, that's fine. But maybe if I come back to them with some other people that are bigger in the cancer world that all think that this is a great idea, then they may reconsider. And so what I did was I reached out to the Israelis again and told them that I'd sort of given it my best effort, but the drug company was saying no, they still didn't want to do it. And then I also, at that time, started attending conferences, and which is one of the most valuable things you can do in that pediatric cancer world. I would attend them and go to all the presentations, both to continue my self-education about cancer, which I just found fascinating, at that time. And then also they're like the greatest networking tool under the sun. So you can go to these cancer conferences and meet all kinds of doctors, researchers, people who are passionate about curing cancer, and also other parents and advocates who are equally motivated. And then so you can rally them and then also learn from them.
What's an example of one of the conferences? I mean, if someone was trying to look up what are some of the conferences that you found most effective or most impactful?
Sure. Well, the first conference I went to was the Renal Tumor Biology Conference, which they only have like at one every 2 or 3 years, but it was put on by the Children's Oncology Group. And so that's what I would suggest. If you have a particular cancer or a particular project that you're interested in, like look not necessarily at the big conferences, but at conferences that are small and focused on your exact interest or your problem. And so I was lucky in that right after we got through treatment, they were having, I think it was the 6th at that time, the 6th annual Pediatric Renal Tumor Conference was in Washington, D.C. And so I thought, well, I should go to that. And then come to find out, all the bigwigs from that world were going because it's such a small conference. So they're all going to be there. And I thought, well, this is a great place to meet them. And then I reached out to Dr. Jeff Dome, who's the chair of the Children's Oncology Group Renal Tumor Committee. And I sent him the paper from Israel. And I said, this is really interesting stuff. I'm sure you're aware of it. But I think, myself and other members of the Wilms community are really interested in this approach, and we would like to see it into trial. And don't you think you should invite the Israelis over to present their work at the conference? And so that's in fact what happened. Was they invited them over, and they came over and gave their presentation. And it was really exciting for me to sit in that room and watch both them give the presentation, and then also the Children's Oncology Group to sort of discuss, where do we go from here? And these are all the decision makers in that world. So they were like, well, what does everybody think? And they kind of hashed it out and talked about the pluses and minuses of the study, and ultimately came away with, everybody thinks this is a pretty good idea, and let's move forward with trying to make this the next clinical trial for Wilms tumor. So that was really exciting to me, just to be part of that process. And then also know that I had, people like Jeff and some others that were really big and well respected in the Children's Oncology Group and at NCI and CTEP and all these organizations that are influential in that world. And so I thought, well, now I have, not only a strong patient community, but also all these big doctors and influential people who also think it's a good idea. Let's go back to the drug company now, or have them go to the drug company and try to get the drug again into a clinical trial. And so that's essentially what happened. It took a while. It took maybe a year and a half after that process. I'll spare you all the nitty gritty details, but it was not an easy process to go through. But essentially, we did end up being successful, and the drug company did end up providing the drug for a trial, and that trial started in, I think it was 2016, in the fall of 2016, and it's still open to this day.
What do you attribute to convincing the drug company finally agreeing to do the trial? Was it ultimately you telling them that all of these influencers in the renal oncology space supported it? Did they actually end up calling the pharmaceutical company? And what were some of the lessons that you learned, things you might have done differently in hindsight to expedite the process? Or do you think this is just the fastest that one could ever have something like this go to trial?
Yeah, well, I'll say that it took a year and a half, and many people have told me that is blazing fast. That this has never happened before in the pediatric cancer world. Sometimes adult trials can get going that fast, but never with kids. And they sort of attribute, my persistence with the reason that happened. I think the official stance from the drug company is nope, it didn't matter. I almost sort of became a thorn in their side, to a certain extent, which is something that was never my intent. But also, I wasn't going to give up, so there's this, I guess, fine line of playing nice and trying to work together, but also getting, accomplishing what you want to do. And so the funny story I tell about that is they sort of cut off communication once they realized I wasn't going away. And they thought, we don't want to really run this trial. A big reason they don't want to run the trial is, well, two main reasons. One, there's a liability factor. So you're putting a drug that's orphaned off an adult disease, and you're trying it in kids, and it's never been tried in children before. So there's a risk factor there. Two, and what I really think it's about is money. These guys, the pharmaceutical company spends millions of dollars developing these drugs. And they really want that drug to work, but they want it to work in a large adult cancer that has many, many, many patients. And so they tried it in like adult multiple myeloma, some of the bigger cancers, and it hadn't worked. But for reasons of this research, we really thought that it would work in Wilms tumor. They tried it in all these CD56 expressing cancers. CD56 is the cancer stem cell for Wilms tumor, and this is the drug that targets CD56. And so they tried it in a lot of adult cancers that express CD56, but our argument was, well, it's not necessarily going to work in those cancers, but we still think it will work in Wilms tumor because CD56 is the cancer stem cell in Wilms tumor, and that was kind of our whole point. But from the drug company's perspective, they look at Wilms tumor and they think, well, there's only 500 kids a year in North America that get Wilms tumor. And of those, most are cured with normal therapy. So this CD56 targeting drug is actually only going to be used by a really small handful of kids, within that 500. So they're never going to be able to make their money back, essentially. And sometimes I think they would rather shelve the drug than have to continue to produce it and the expense of manufacturing it for only a few patients.
Well, I suppose it makes sense when you think about criticizing the drug companies for these decisions. You don't think about your 401k being invested in these drug companies, right, so that they will make these kind of decisions so that you have money when you retire. I mean, that's a hard thing.
Yeah.
So now I don't understand, how did you convince them to do it? I mean, did you just wear them down, or did you create such an intrigue or curiosity in what other things this trial might reveal? How did you?
I wouldn't say I wore them down by any means. I think that the strongest thing I did and what ultimately ended up being successful was just getting the support from bigger doctors, from researchers, also the patient community, but it was a combination of all those things that came together. So yeah, it was like it's not just one single thing, it was just a lot of pressure from a lot of different sides. And I'll say, the drug company, they were sympathetic, like they understood, here's a dad with a kid in trouble and he really wants to make a difference and he likes this drug that we have, and so I think they understood, from a personal level, but they just like you said, like financially, it just doesn't make sense. And these guys, drug companies are all beholden to their shareholders and they're in business to make money. And this is not a way to make money.
Absolutely.
By investing in kids. So
now this year plus goes by, and are you by day slowly becoming a researcher, or are you still doing your contracting work? I mean, each day that goes by, what does your average day look like during that period where you're waiting for the drug company to agree to go to trial?
Sure. Yeah, that was the transition period to becoming a researcher. And so what I would do is I basically had my eye on really getting this drug into trial. And I spent a lot of time advocating for it and working on it, doing conference calls with patients and with also with the Children's Oncology Group and sort of discussing strategies, as to how we would move forward. And so what I would do is I just, I have a good work ethic, basically. And so I'd wake up at like 5 a.m. and I'd go to a coffee shop and I would do research on cancer from 5 until 9. And then I, of course, had to pay the bills. So I would go do tile work from 9 to 5. And then I'd go home and hang out with the family and put the kids to bed. And then I'd get back on the computer and research, oftentimes until midnight. And then I would just do that day in and day out and day in and day out. And again, it's hard to keep that pace up. But when you're thinking about, your kid potentially dying, it's like you have this huge motivation to just keep moving forward. And what I did with that trial was essentially, I just saw myself as like a cheerleader, like I just want to keep the bug in the ear, of the people that are important in making these decisions. And so I didn't want to bother them. I wouldn't like call them every day by any means, but I would, there'd be like a flurry of activity. We'd have a conference call and we'd say, okay, we'd, get some action points and these are the things we're going to do to move forward. And then I would kind of follow up with people and then sort of let it lie for a little while. And then if I hadn't heard anything in, say, a month or 6 weeks, I'd just get the round of emails back up again and phone calls and start calling people and emailing people and saying, hey, where are we at? And basically just not letting it fall off of anybody's radar. And so that's what I did. And in that process, it really got me interested in the research end of cancer. And I, of course, was passionate about children with cancer at that point, just because of my own experience and then in doing this. And I almost felt an obligation to share that information with other families, because I could look back and see how I could imagine other families with other cancers in similar situations that I was in. And I know how that felt, of just not understanding the disease and not knowing how to move forward. But there, I had just spent the last 2 or 3 years, like just, really intensely studying the disease and then also meeting the people that were important in that world and figuring out how to get clinical trials done. So that's what I did. I met some other families that were in similar situations and kind of offered to help basically do the same thing that I'd done with my own daughter, offered to help and do that for other kids, and was successful taking that approach with other cancers. And that was very rewarding, and also just kind of continued my education, because I had sort of solely focused on Wilms tumor for a long time. So it was nice to learn 3 or 4 other pediatric cancers, learn who was important in their world, as far as decision makers and influencers. And then also just like characterizing those diseases and seeing how they were similar and different to Wilms tumor. And ultimately, I came away from that experience and still just found myself fascinated by cancer research as an art, and felt like, had maybe another aha moment where I felt like, okay, there's these kids out here who have really rare cancers, maybe only 3 or 4 kids diagnosed every year or even less. And they're just kind of pushed under the bed because no one has any research on them. There's no good treatments because researchers can't get funding to study diseases that only impact, a handful of kids every year. So they're just very understudied. And that results in these kids who go into the clinic and are asked to follow protocols for other cancers. Because there are no protocols for their particular cancer. Oh. And unfortunately, if you know anything about the cancer world, there's hundreds of different cancers, and they're all treated differently and specifically. And so unfortunately for those kids that don't have a lot of research behind them, they have to follow other cancer protocols for treatment, and many of those are not successful. And so I kind of thought to myself, well, one way to really make a difference in that world would be to actually jump into the research lab and do the research, figure out ways to do the research for those kids with really rare cancers, and just sort of find a way, one way or the other. We're going to look at those. Those kids are the most important thing, and we'll figure out a way to fund the research and start exploring those particular cancers.
How did you become a cancer researcher? I mean, let me ask a background question. Had you had any experience in biology, microbiology, biochemistry, any of that in your prior life? No
experience whatsoever. But I did have, just that I basically self-taught myself at that point in time. But I'd had some accomplishments under my belt, right? So like we had gotten that trial going. I'd written some nice reports and papers for these other families that characterized their cancers. And so that was one big question, is like, how am I going to move, from essentially a stonemason to a cancer researcher? How am I going to do that? And I felt, I'm 42 years old. So I felt like if I had spent, 6 or 8 years going back to school, that's really kind of setting me back. Not that I wouldn't mind going to school. I would love to sort of squeeze that in somehow. But I also felt like I'd learned a lot, and it would be better to try to move forward, by directly getting into a lab. And so what happened with my story was I was on a conference call while I was helping a family with a little kid with Epithelioid Sarcoma. And we were on a conference call with Dr. Charles Keller. And Charles was in Portland at the time. He was at OHSU. And he's a pediatric oncologist who had turned into a researcher. And he's a very nice guy. And he told me about this course that he had every summer called the Pediatric Cancer Nano Course. And it was a week-long boot camp that basically he reached out to the community, the childhood cancer community, and said, anybody that's interested, you're welcome to come to the lab for a week, and you can shadow a scientist and check out what we do. And there'll be lectures about the various issues in childhood cancer. And then we'll also break into groups and pick certain childhood cancers and develop what he calls research roadmaps. So basically just characterize the current state of the disease and then make suggestions as to how we can move forward, what we can do to get more research into those diseases. And so when he told me about that, I just was like, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want to do.
Right.
And so I got off the phone and immediately signed up for that cancer nano course and went there. And that was in 2015. That was my first experience in a lab. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was really great. It's a very intense week. But I'd had a lot of questions, where I had read a lot of journal articles, and I'd spent hundreds and hundreds of hours, reading these things. And I understood at that time, I understood a lot of the concepts and pathways involved in cancer, but there was still always this kind of big blank space of like, what does a lab actually look like? What are these experiments that I read about all the time? I mean, I always am reading about drug screens and Western blot analysis and PCRs. And so all these things that I just kind of skimmed over when I read, because I just had no idea like what they look like, you know? And so here was this kind of opportunity to get into the lab and actually run a drug screen and see cell cultures and actually get my hands in there, you know? And so that was really exciting for me. And so I went through that week, and then basically took Charles out to dinner at the end of the week. And I said, you know, what would a guy like me do, a stonemason, if I wanted to make this sort of midlife career transition and become a cancer researcher? And he says, well, you should maybe reach out to some people with some labs, some cancer research labs, and see if you could do an internship, you know, take a sabbatical from your tile and stone work and offer to do an internship. And my response to him was, well, when can I start?
Brilliant.
Yeah. And so he kind of backed. I said, whoa. I wasn't thinking about me, you know, but we eventually convinced him that it would be a good idea. And so he, first thing he says is, well, I'm not paying for it. You know, you're going to have to come up with some funding and figure out a way to be able to take time off from tile and come do an internship. And so that's what I did. I did some online crowdfunding fundraisers, because I had grown up this sort of nice patient community who had all kind of looked at what I'd done over the years and respected that. And so I get I still to this day get a lot of support from that community. And then I also applied to the Alex's Lemonade Stand for a post grant, which is a grant that is a small grant. It's a $5,000 grant, and it's typically for medical students, and it's given to them for them to go work in a pediatric focused cancer lab as an intern, basically. So I wasn't in med school, but they kind of looked at what I wanted to do in life and this internship, and so they very nicely awarded me one of those awards. And that was it. So in 2016, I took some time off from work and came out to Portland, Oregon, and did an internship in Dr. Keller's lab. And I was really excited. And that was kind of the start of it all as far as becoming a researcher.
Were you focusing your research on Wilms at that time?
Yeah. Yep. I had studied several other cancers. I hadn't focused on Wilms tumor in several years. So when Charles, you know, very nicely said, well, what do you want to study first? I thought, well, this would be a great time to sort of bring it all around, you know, and take a revisit with Wilms tumor. And so my proposal, you know, he said, so come up with a project, write up, you know, a project proposal, and we can use that to, you know, get support and some grants and then also focus on a project in the lab. And so what I study now and what I did in the internship was I wrote up a proposal to study anaplastic Wilms tumor. And it basically is, the study is trying to develop a novel drug combination that's geared specifically to the anaplastic subtype of Wilms tumor. And so the problem right now is that all Wilms tumors, both anaplastic and non-anaplastic, are treated the same way, even though we know that for the anaplastic Wilms tumors, their outcomes are dismal. So my thought is, let's focus on the anaplastic subtype and develop some smart targeted therapies that are specific to anaplasia in Wilms tumor, and then do the research and see if we can't come up with a better treatment option for those particular kids. And so when I did the internship, I knew that that was going to be my focus. And I also recognized that it was important to get some meaningful work done and collect some meaningful data so that I could move forward. I was very interested in making a career of this and not a 6-week internship. So we got in and went right to work right away. And basically what I did was I collected all the existing cell lines and study models that exist for Wilms tumor, and then started genetically sequencing them and drug screening them, and collected a pretty large collection of genetic sequencing data and functional drug screen data, which had two cohorts, regular Wilms tumor and anaplastic Wilms tumor. And so with that data, it wasn't enough to make a prediction of a therapy yet, but it was a large collection of data. And so I used that data to apply for bigger grants. So the next grant cycle, I applied for 3 grants based off of that project and was able to share all the data that I'd already collected. And I was awarded 2 of those 3 grants. So essentially that was the start of it all, because that totaled out at about $300,000 to study anaplastic Wilms tumor. And with that kind of money, Dr. Keller very nicely offered me a job at the lab. And so I started this past summer full time.
What were the results of that trial, and how does that influence your research now, and where are they with that trial?
Sure. Well, the trial is still ongoing. I will say that it has not been published, the results from that trial. I will say I've spoken with several doctors that are involved in the trial, and their indication to me is that, unfortunately, the trial has not done all that well for Wilms tumor kids. It has seemed to work well for some other cancers that were involved in the trial. So there's a little bit of promise there. But unfortunately, the Wilms patients that I personally know that have gone on to the trial, it hasn't worked for them. So part of the idea with this study that I'm doing at cc-TDI is you never want to put all your eggs in one basket, right? So we just want other options out there. And sadly, in the childhood cancer world, you kind of go through the standard treatment options, and then oftentimes you just run out of options. There's nothing left. And so our hope is that this study will result in a promising approach that we can move into clinical trials so that it is an option for those kids.
Before we get into the quick, curious questions and wrap up, how is Stella doing?
Stella's doing great. I should have said that in the beginning, but Stella is she's actually 5 years cancer-free now, which is really amazing. I mean, the official stats there are that 24 out of 25 kids with her particular cancer and metastasis in her situation don't make it. So she miraculously appears to be that one, and we count our blessings every day for that.
The next steps are for you to find the next miracle cure for Wilms tumor. Are your family here? Is everyone's moved here? What did you do with your tile business? What are the particulars with regard to that?
Yeah. So basically I've made the transition. So I did the internship for 6 weeks, and then I would go back and forth. So my family was in Montana. The lab is in Portland. So I came out for the 6 weeks. Then I'd go back home to Montana. And then I just keep going back and forth as throughout that next year as I was applying for the bigger grants. In an effort to keep my study going, basically, I had started a good study with the internship, but I didn't want to see it mothballed for a year. I wanted to keep moving forward with it. So I would go back and forth. I'd basically volunteer in the lab for a month and then go home and work for a month and then and back and forth. But then when we were awarded the grants and I was offered a full-time position at the lab, we made the plunge. And so we closed the tile business and sold our house in Bozeman, and the whole family moved out to Portland.
All right. And then at the very end, we'll get to how people can get a hold of you and any ask that you have. Before we do, I always like to end with what I call quick, curious questions, or QCQs.
Okay.
What advice would you give your 30-year-old self?
Advice for my 30-year-old self, I would say don't give up, keep going. Life is strange and you never know how it's going to work out, and just go with the flow. Okay.
And what is something that you believe that most people think is crazy?
Something I believe that most people think is crazy. I believe there's a cure for cancer. I think that's a bold statement, and many people would say Yeah, that's a good idea, but I don't know if it's ever really going to happen. And I think we're right there. This is a really exciting time to be in the cancer research world. We just make breakthroughs day after day, and I really strongly believe that we're gonna see the day where we put all of ourselves out of business by curing cancer, and that ultimately is the goal.
Well, I hope that crazy thought comes true. And without belaboring it too much, do you think that people should think of cancer as one entity or one disease to combat? Or are all of these different cancers completely different things, and the cure will come from just a whole bunch of different kinds of treatment protocols or methods of attack?
Yeah. So it's important that people don't think of cancer as all one thing. They're all very different. However, you can learn there's certain theories that you can learn by studying one cancer that are applicable to the rest of cancers. And it's important to keep that in mind. And childhood cancer is a really good example of of both how cancers are different and also how they can be applicable to other cancers. And so one of the big problems we face in the childhood cancer world is it's often the case that researchers, drug companies, anybody in that world is going to say, well, because of the liability of working with children and the sort of lack of funding in that world, what our approach will be is to study adult cancers and then use that knowledge gleaned in adult cancers and apply it to kids. And there's been many research papers and studies done on how children's cancers are very different than adults' cancers. And so I just think that argument is probably not going to pan out. For the obvious, there's many examples of that, but the most obvious being most adult cancers are sort of lifestyle cancers or long-term environmental exposure cancers. And with kids, this clearly is not the case. These clearly arise from birth and are not the result of lifestyle choices or of exposure to toxins. And so you have a clear case that childhood cancer is different than adult cancers. And so the thought that adult treatments are going to work in kids is a pretty far-fetched idea. The flip side is that kids provide a really good study model, which could be possibly applied to adults. And the reason is with adult cancers, you tend to have a very high mutational burden. So you have lots and lots of different mutations. Now, as a scientist, you look at that and you say, well, what's the most important mutation? But you're looking at this field of hundreds or thousands of different mutations. So how do you pick the one that really drives the disease? In kids, they tend to only have a few mutations. Some cancers only have one mutation or one genetic fusion or abnormality. And so you really right away know what is driving that disease. And so you can take like a kids cancer and look at it and say, well, there's only 2 mutations involved in this. And then you look at an adult kidney cancer and you say, well, there's 100 mutations, but those same 2 mutations that were found in kids are also in the adult ones. And so maybe those are the 2 that we should focus on.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Very interesting to think of children's cancer research as foundational for general cancer research. I hope that what most people think is crazy, that you are correct about it. What do you want to, I hope you're correct. What do you want to ask of listeners, and how can people get a hold of you?
Let's see. So I'm easy to get a hold of. You can find me on Facebook, just search Andy Woods, and I'll pop up fairly quickly. I can also leave you my email address and phone number. Maybe you can put that on the link to the podcast. And I'm happy to respond to anybody who wants to reach out. specific asks. There's two specific asks I could think of. We're coming up on year 2 of my study at Wilms tumor study at Children's Cancer Therapy Development Institute. And so we're looking for more funding to continue that study on. So just a donation to that study would be wonderful. And there's several ways to donate to that, but probably the easiest way is through, I have an online crowdfunding campaign going through consano.org. And you can probably also put that link up. Which will go right to my Wilms tumor study. One thing I recently started being a lot more active in at cc-TDI is I run their CureFast tumor registry, which is a biobank and essentially collects tissue donations, both surgical material and then also autopsy specimens. We collect those in the lab and we bank them. And importantly, we do more than bank them. We actively work with that tissue. So we cryopreserve it in a special way that can be made into immortalized cell lines so that we can provide that to other researchers for their studies. We develop mouse models. We drug screen all samples that come in. It's a really cool and very important biobank that we do, but it's also self-funded by the lab. So we're always trying to find ways to support that. And so there's a link on the cc-TDI website that will bring you right to the CureFast tumor registry, and you can both find out about it there and make a donation to it if you wish.
We will have all of the links to all of those opportunities and links to how people can get a hold of you in the show notes at Applied Curiosity Lab /blog. And I am really, really thankful and appreciative of your time, and your story is fascinating. And I love talking to you. And I hope that we can spread the word and get people filling the piggy bank and help work toward a cure for Wilms tumor cancer and cancer in general.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Becky. I really appreciate you sharing the story. And it's always nice to be able to talk about childhood cancer and think about the cures. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Andy Woods is a cancer researcher at the Children's Cancer Therapy Development Institute. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. Before you take off, I have a quick question and a few more things to let you know about. 1. You can find show notes and all resources mentioned at appliedcuriositylab.com/blog. And the question: would you enjoy joining the ranks of curiosity seekers and adventurous thinkers? If so, you are invited to join the Tribe of the Curious. You'll receive Quick Curiosity Monday. This short weekly email is curiosity lube for your brain. It consists of ideas I'm pondering, curiosities the tribe has shared, and things that I'm enjoying that I suspect you might too. Just go to appliedcuriositylab.com to join, or you can probably just pick your favorite search engine and type in Tribe of the Curious. And let's connect online at Becky Saltzman on Twitter and on Facebook at Applied Curiosity Lab. Finally, in order to avoid missing insights from outside the boundaries of ordinary, subscribe to Applied Curiosity Lab Radio on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, and all the other places podcasts hide and wait to be discovered. In the meantime, elevate curiosity.